because we've both worked for companies that said, well, we're a meritocracy, right? We've been
Yeah.
we've heard that language. I don't know if those companies are still doing that, but I know that I've said before, I hadn't really thought about what this is. And so can you actually kind of level set with us, kind of what are the components of meritocracy? What is meritocracy, and what are the components when you actually think about it?
Yeah, and so the components really are, as I was thinking about how to possibly answer that type question, the components aren't complicated, right? The components of meritocracy it's an idea. I think one of the first things you need to realize it's an ideal. It is a philosophy, if you will, that any social or economic, legal, political rewards that you receive tracks directly to your capability, your own skills, your ability. Your achievement is because you've earned it. So that's what meritocracy talks about, right? But the problem with meritocracy is it creates an almost impossible situation. And what's really fascinating, not only for the people who are at disadvantage because of this ideal, there are critiques in this space that say even the people who benefit from the notion of meritocracy, Markovich, who I'm going to talk about here in a moment, says that they're miserable, and that the outcomes of meritocracy actually working like it should is that people who are benefits from it are miserable. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. So the way to think about meritocracy then is that there have been a couple critiques of it. And again, I'm going to geek out academic wise, and I'll try to keep it pretty quick.
PhDs are allowed to do that.
but it's interesting for people to understand that there's good research and discussions to be had around meritocracy, right? And so one of the critiques was this aspirational critique of meritocracy, and it argues that the problem with our current system that we have isn't the ideal of meritocracy itself, but is the collective failure of us to live up to what meritocracy is supposed to produce. So aspirational critics say meritocracy is not the problem. It's the fact that we're not operating it right. Right. So that's one. So hold on to that for a second, right? I think that's important. So then you have this principled critique of meritocracy that argues that any society that has socioeconomic rewards, or whatever rewards you say, that are based on merit, is itself inherently unjust. There's no way to make it just, because if it's based on this merit and the definition of merit and what you do, it's just going to be unjust. And so Markovich created this whole notion of the meritocracy trap, and I think that was one of the questions you wanted to get at. And the meritocracy trap, the book that was written by Markovich, was the scathing critique of primarily the aspirational critique that I just mentioned a moment ago, that the problem with our current system isn't the ideal of meritocracy, is that meritocracy isn't working like it should. And what he says, and Markovich argued that meritocracy itself is the problem, right? And that it produces a few things, right? And this is where I think the audience who does ID&E work can really get into it. He says that meritocracy produces radical inequality. It produces, and it stifles social mobility, and that it makes everyone, including, he calls them the winners, and he calls them elites, the ones who benefit from it, miserable. And it's super interesting. But at the same time, Markovich isn't ready to just reject meritocracy all in hand and saying that it's not possible. He thinks it's possible to create, but you have to re-envision how you do it, right? And so what Markovich would say, and I think this is interesting too, is that the rising inequality that we've seen is a product of meritocracy itself. And so what he says, it's really interesting that there's been a shift. If you go back 60, 70, 80, 90 years, you could always tell who was poor because they were working super hard. They were the ones working tons of hours and dirty, and the elites were the ones who could sit back and enjoy their wealth. He says that that's flipped. And then what's happened nowadays is that you have people who are like, Cody, how many hours a week do you work sometimes? 60, 70, 80 hours a week? Right? So what he's saying is that that's a product of meritocracy because you've gotten the education, the skill, you've gotten to a position that you are in, and that you're working harder, and that actually the people who are in elites in your position and my position are actually 60, 70, 80, 90 hours. It far exceeds what people are doing in lower and middle class. And I think you could argue some of that, right? But stay with me. It's just principally what he's saying is that this is flipped. And then the product of meritocracy then is you've seen a changing in the type of education that people can get, the types of industries we're in. And so you have jobs the middle class and poor class would normally do are now being replaced by people who have this knowledge basis and technology and that kind of thing. So it shrinks the mobility of the middle class because now they're not able to get the skills to get into this upper group that's dominated by the elites. So, which is fascinating. So what he says and where this all plays out to on how it causes misery for everyone is people's health have, because of the long hours people are working and this competitive drive that meritocracy drives, right? You're less healthy. You have less time to spend with your family. You have less time to build relationships. And in fact, one of the things he talks about, which is super interesting, you hear people all the time, and I don't know if you've ever said this, I want to spend quality time with my kids. And what he's saying, and Markovich is saying, is actually what they probably want is quantity time and not quality time. But because there's such a meritocratic drive to do this, has created that kind of inequality. So it's a real long-winded response for your audience to think about. It's not just as simple to say meritocracy is false. There are certain critiques to look at it, whether it's aspirational or if it's the principled, and that, is meritocracy actually operating how it's supposed to and creating this inequality and stifled social class? Or is it not? The reason we see inequality is that it's not working as it should. So there's so many ways to think about it, man, but it's powerful to just, I think, understand the nuances so you can have the discussions with people about it. So that's a long-winded response.